I'm recording.
Sorry.
Okay.
Okay.
So this is a piece about the way in which we dealt with the attempt by the government in Britain to close Summerhill School, and that I think is a good case about how we have to sometimes deal with authorities. When Summerhill had an inspection from the government, there were a number of criticisms, and actually what the government was saying was, you have to make these changes or we close you down. So it's very serious. And in England, it is illegal to run a school if it's not registered. It's a criminal offence. You can be put in prison if you run a school that has not been approved by the government inspectors, basically. So it was a very serious thing for a school that has existed for such a long time to be threatened with closure. And of course what the inspectors were saying was for Summerhill to change some of its basic philosophies and ways of working. Some of them were very silly complaints, like the toilets, because they boys and girls can use similar toilet, but it's not urinals, it's it's cabins people go in, it's not any problem, but that was one of the silly complaints they made. Others were more serious about the fact that it is optional for children to go into classes, and they alleged that children were wasting their time and not learning, and so there was quite a serious complaint. I phoned up Zoe Redhead, the principal, and said, well, what you're doing is, in complaining about the inspection, is all the things that the government expects. They're quite used to people getting up petitions, raising questions, going into the media, all the usual things. The government's very good at dealing with those strategies, and that you really need to do something different, because if you just do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got, meaning the government will get away with this if you're not careful. And this would be very serious, because Summerhill is a model of a certain approach to schooling that needs to survive, in our view, especially because it is popular with parents. So I suggested that we have an alternative inspection, that Ofsted, the Office of Standards in Education in England, sends in a team of inspectors, and frankly they don't really go in depth in these investigations, and clearly this one was very poorly done, but was working to some kind of agenda that the government really would quite like to close this school. So I got a group of people together who were more skilled, more knowledgeable, more expert in their own fields than the team of inspectors. One of whom was Derry, sitting here, who had already done inspections, government inspections, and he can tell you about that. So obviously he was very experienced, but also had two principals, heads of boarding schools, that one of which was quite traditional school, but I happen to know the head, and another one which was not as radical as Summerhill, but was quite interesting. So there were two, if you like, comparable schools with people who headed up them for a long time, who were experienced heads. University academics who had serious studies of education. A friend of mine who was a management consultant, formerly worked with the Ford Motor Company and had written a lot about organisations. So he was very experienced. We also got the children. We have someone called the Children's Poet Laureate, meaning that I don't know how long they last for. I think a year or two. But anyway, Michael Rosen is a well-known poet, and he has a doctorate in children's literature. So as well as being a broadcaster and a famous poet, he does have a PhD. So it was a pretty impressive team of people, and what they did was to go into Summerhill and spend a lot of time finding out about the school. One of the heads of a boarding school actually slept in overnight, so he went one day, spent time with the children, and the staff slept in overnight, went around the next day, so that he could get a full experience. And so there's various people who have done this. So we were keen to do something that was very rigorous and very in-depth and thorough, and which had explored both the philosophy of the school and then the practice, how this had worked out in practice. And we wrote a report, and also I sent a letter to the Chief Inspector, head of Ofsted, to ask some questions, and actually it was quite nice that we got a reply, and it helped us in fact, because again his assertions and those in the report were clearly quite faulty, and they'd made various judgments about the school which they didn't have a basis for. They broke their own rules. They're supposed to do an objective assessment, and it was very subjective. So Derry can talk about the qualification side, which is one example where they were faulty. So we put the report into the government, and when it went for trial, because clearly the government was sticking to its guns and said they were going to take them to what is called a tribunal, which was a judge and two former school heads with the tribunal in the courts of justice, so a very formal, serious thing. And our report was going to feature. It didn't in the end. Well, it did in the sense that the government realised that there was quite a serious opposition to it, but in the end the government didn't continue its campaign after a certain point within the trial, and maybe Derry could talk about that. So we won in the end. That was the basic thing, and I think I suppose the message I was trying to do here to people was think carefully about your strategy when you are trying to deal with authorities. Try to do something that's serious and rigorous. You know, we weren't playing around. We took this very seriously, and we tried to do a proper job in terms of a real piece of research on the place, and that I think made a big difference. But I'll hand over to Derry, who can talk more about the trial and his role in the report.
It was excuse me, a very interesting experience for me, because I was actually an inspector at this time. When Zoe Redhead asked me if I could help the school, I wasn't sure whether I could legally or not, but the lawyers said it was okay. So I played two roles, one working as part of Ian's team, where I particularly looked at the examination results of the school. This was interesting because Ofsted said the inspectors said they couldn't examine the examination results because the children took the examinations at different ages. In the English inspection system, only examinations taken at 16 count for the statistics. Well, I ignored that, and I looked back over the previous 4 years, and what I found was that 63% of Summerhill students gained the required number of examinations. I didn't bother about how old they were because it didn't seem important to me. What was important was how many examinations did they have. And what I found was 63% reached the national standard, whereas in the state school system only 42% had reached the national standard. So this school that the government wanted to close was more successful at examinations, which was supposed to be the whole point of education for these inspectors, than the public school system. That was a nice finding. Another finding was that because of the democratic open meeting system, the school was a very safe school from a child protection point of view. It would be impossible for a paedophile to survive in such an environment. And there were a number of other ways in which the school was successful. I have been working with the Council of Europe and with the UK government to create a democratic citizenship curriculum. I'd said to the minister that if he wanted kids to learn about democracy, there had to be some democracy in the school and not just teachers talking about it. And what I found, of course, at Summerhill was a wonderful working example of democracy, and children were really learning every day about democracy and human rights. So I made these contributions to Ian's report, and the report was quoted in the English Parliament, in both parts of the English Parliament, in defence of the school, as well as being quoted in the court case in defence of the school. So I think it was a very powerful document. I was reading it on the flight over here, and I hadn't read it for probably 15 years. And I thought, this is really good. Did we write this? It was really very effective. But I did play one other role in the inspection, which was a bit more secret. I actually worked with the lawyers, and the chief Summerhill lawyer was probably the most famous human rights, civil rights lawyer in the English language, Geoffrey Robertson. And I worked with him. He was given all the documents that were completed by the inspectors, all their notes of meetings, etc., 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 for the whole inspection. I found two errors in these reports. One was really serious, and the other one was perhaps a bit more trivial. The serious one was this: before any recommendation is made in the report, there must be evidence that all the inspectors have met together, discussed the issue, and are all in agreement with each other. They must make a consensus decision before making a finding and a recommendation. There was no evidence in the documentation that they had ever held these meetings and had ever agreed on the findings. The findings had all been written by the senior inspector. This completely discredited the inspection. The other thing, which you might think is either, trivial or even funny, one of the complaints about the teaching was that the spelling of words was not sufficiently corrected by the teachers. They found one or two spelling mistakes written by children, and the teachers hadn't corrected it. I discovered that one of the inspectors, it was the technology inspector, I think he must have been dyslexic, because he made 35 spelling mistakes in a 3-page report. So I thought, I can't resist it. So I said to the lawyer, have a look at these reports by the technology inspector, full of spelling mistakes. I can't remember whether that came out in court or not. But the court case was a wonderful experience, because the judge allowed the children from Summerhill to come into the courtroom. It was quite a small courtroom. So all the lawyers and the witnesses like us, we had to all squeeze up so that we could fit the kids in. And after 2.5 days, the government case collapsed, basically. The government said, we give in, on the most important thing from Summerhill's point of view, which was children being able to choose whether they wanted to go to lessons or not. The government gave up on that one, and the judge said to the children in the court, it was very beautiful, he said, I understand you run your school with a democratic meeting. Is the chair of the meeting here? And a 16-year-old girl called Carmen put her hand up, and he said, would you like to have a meeting in court, my dear, in order to decide whether you accept the government new conditions or not? And she said yes, and all the adults, like Ian and I, had to leave the court, and it was just, he left also, and Zoe, the principal, and the children were the only people left in the court, and they had a school meeting in the courtroom. Ian and I went to the pub over the road with some people from the school. I got rather drunk and couldn't find my way home. But anyway, that's another story. But this case has been very, very important. One problem, it has led people in some other countries who've got into trouble with their inspectors to think perhaps that a good way is to go to court. My advice to them is don't go that way unless you absolutely have to, because there now are some schools in different countries, one in Munich in Bavaria, Germany, which has just lost its court case, and after 2 years the school has had to close. So my advice is basically negotiate with the inspectors if you possibly can, make some tiny compromises that don't mean too much if you possibly can. Don't go to court unless you have to.
Great.
And I think that's my time.
You have to go?
I do.
You can stay, and is it okay?
Of course.
Cheers,
I
mate.
can count.
Good to see you.
Which question would you like to make him, in case it was you who interviewed him? I wanted to do also the other,
Okay.
but...
Yeah, here's my question. A friend of mine, a famous psychologist in the States, in the United States, says the school system is beyond hope. It's beyond repair. It's so bad, it just has to be shut down. Does he agree with that, or does he think there are some changes we can make to the school system?
Thank
How's
you,
that?
thank
Okay.
you. Thank you very much.
I always ask him that one, so he's got hundreds of answers. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Just a
Shall I
second.
finish off a bit on the summer hill?
Yeah, just a second.
And then I'll answer his question.
Okay. Tell me.
Okay, so Derry's point about not going to court, I think, is a very useful one. It was a decision of the school to challenge it, and the only way they could was to go to what was called this tribunal. And clearly it's not ideal when it cost them a lot of money, but luckily they had ways of getting that money. But not everybody does, and lawyers can get very expensive. So, I mean, our notion of a report was to, yes, get publicity, have it in the newspapers, in Parliament, have it talked about, to put pressure on the Minister and on people in Parliament, and to use a different kind of pressure other than petitions and demonstrations, and to do one that couldn't be challenged in a way. I mean, that these were 8 serious professional people. Derry, Hannam had done 82 inspections of schools as an in-government inspector, and the other people were very serious professional people, all of whom put their name to that report. So it couldn't really be dismissed by anybody. It couldn't be dismissed as a shoddy piece of work or biased. So that was important, and I certainly agree that it's not a good idea to think about using the law if we can avoid it. In one of the sessions here, somebody was asking about hiring lawyers and things, and I said, well, my role as in charge of self-managed learning college in England is to know the law. I'm afraid I every new Act of Parliament I read to make certain that I know anything that would affect us. So maybe it's difficult for people to have that time, but I think to hire lawyers just costs too much money, and lawyers don't really understand this world. They're used to more clear-cut. It's a black and white decision. Either it's this or it's that. It's guilty or innocent. So the law works in that kind of way, which is, I don't think, always helpful. So when we had the session here about ways of dealing with authority, I was saying, well, this is one example. There are other examples, like, as Derry's mentioned, you can try and get alongside the people in authority. For instance, we started our alternative programme because we're not a school, and we keep going, but also say we're not a school, but to work with the local council. And in fact, I worked with the strategy director in education, and he had to write a strategic plan for a 5-year period, and he actually put mention of our college in it as a model for what secondary schools could be like. So that came out of me working with him, letting him come and see what we do, offering help, pointing out that there were problems in the schools in the area and that they could think differently. And so that's a good example of working alongside people in authority.